Alberta, you're a lady. I guess songwriter Shannon Two Feathers had some kind of special inspiration when he wrote those words, because, Alberta, you are quite a lady. You're subject to the whims and the fancies and the changes of mood and attitude that is the right of every temperamental woman. And yet you maintain a beauty and kindness and gentleness that seems to belong to you alone, Alberta. So here am I, to sit down and tell you folks a story about Alberta, my favorite province, the province of my birth, my childhood, my rearing, the province of my choice. A province so diverse and so bountiful, so kind to its inhabitants, and at the same time a province that can change and turn a harsher cheek. A province that has known so much history and looks forward to so much future. Where do you start to tell the story of Alberta? Well, if I had the long-range vision of one of our famous bighorn sheep, then I could lie on an alpine meadow and curl up comfortable and content in the shiny Alberta sun and look at our plains to the east just as far as my eyes could see. And that might be a good place to start telling the story from. Wait. No, better yet, perhaps you should put yourself in that position so that you can see all of my province at once, and then I'll travel across it, stopping here and there. And I'll point out some of the highlights. In other words, I'll do the work, and you look to the horizons, south, east, and north, and maybe we can gain an appreciation of the diversity and splendor that is Alberta. I'm going to start down this river. I could pick from many, but I'm going to choose the Red Deer, because I think it outlines best the ages of our province before the white man's coming gave us a written chronicle of events. You see, along the cliffs of the Red Deer River, the erosion of wind and water has created a geological time chart that graphically illustrates the ages from the beginning of time. Dr. Wes Reed, who lived in and studied the formations of the Badlands for many years, provides us with this great description. A great gash eroded by the southeasterly flow of the Red Deer River. It seems to be another world as the valley shears through stratum after stratum of the Earth's history, as through a gigantic layer cake. Up and down the valley stretch the Badlands, a panoramic wonderland of bizarre and complex ridges, pyramids, steep bluffs, massive buttes, steep-walled gorges and canyons. The terraced, multicolored walls are composed of layer upon layer of shale, sandstone, ironstone, bentonite, and clay. The Badlands colors range from black through brown and buff to gray and white, and vary with every change in weather, hour, and season. The colors are soft and tinged with mauve after a summer shower, tinged with pink and gold at sunset, and rather flat and drab at high noon. The Badlands provide a show window through which it is possible to look into the heart of one of the world's most dramatic demonstrations of the great sedimentary land-building processes displayed in the colored bands of the formations. And the most dramatic of all was the age of the dinosaur. Now, dinosaur bones are still found in size and quantity and provide concrete evidence of highly specialized and bizarre giant lizards who lived in a huge delta of swamps and brackish water along the western border of the inland sea. There were literally hordes of dinosaurs. Some reached a weight of 10 tons. But not all were giants. Most were large, true enough, but some were no larger than a rooster. The spectacular dinosaur age came to an end in a tragic fashion for the giant lizards, though. With the coming of the Ice Age about 1 million years ago, huge ice caps formed in the Arctic regions and began to flow southward over North America. That was the end for the giant lizards. Alberta remained as an ice-free corridor until about 35,000 years ago. Finally, slow-moving sheets of ice up to 5,000 feet thick, advancing from the north and east, began to grind ponderously over Alberta. At the same time, another sheet of ice formed in the Rocky Mountain region. It flowed out to meld with the other, making Alberta a waste of ice. Pre-existing valleys, including that of this Red Deer River, had their irregular slopes smoothed by the passage of the ice. Now, the last retreat of the ice began about 12,000 years ago and left enduring impressions on the landscape. Alberta, as we know her now, had finally been shaped. But let's stay with this river. This river has seen it all. There were millions of buffalo feeding in its lush valleys. Massacres, Indian battles, trader skirmishes, prairie fires took place along her banks. The Indian, the trapper, the trader, the missionary, the gold miner, the settler, and the farmer have all navigated and used from the waters of this river. It has been host to millions of migratory birds every spring and fall since its time began. At any rate, we've reached a new chapter for our river and our province. The Indian and the buffalo now are the focus of our attention. The Indian's diet was meat. Every prairie brave was a skilled buffalo hunter. He could shoot a killing arrow from the bare back of his pony through the tough hide of a galloping bull. When necessary, a band of braves would stampede entire herds over steep cliffs to their death. Right along this river, there are many buffalo kills. The earliest of Western Canadian Indians hunted on foot, and their wanderings, no doubt, were determined by the direction the buffalo took. But even the buffalo had a migratory pattern, and over thousands of years, foot trails, which later became horse and travois trails, were scarred across the prairie. When the buffalo hunters finally made contact with more southern tribes, they became exposed for the first time to horses. It quickly became apparent that they would be more effective hunters when mounted, and the desirability of horses inspired many a stealthy raid on the neighboring tribes' herds of mustangs. By the time the first explorers reached Western Canada, it is likely they encountered skilled Indian horsemen among every prairie tribe. It's likely, too, that the earliest white men and their colorful voyageurs were quick to follow the Indian trails, knowing they would always keep them in touch with food sources and water. Some of Alberta's famous trails still parallel or in fact follow on top of these early Indian trails. From your viewpoint, high on that alpine meadow, look now with your mind's eye to the plains below, and you'll be able to imagine an age in which Indian and buffalo predominate Alberta's plains. Grant McEwen's picture of this relationship between Indian and buffalo bears quoting. The prairie Indian ate fresh buffalo meat as long as they could get it, and when they could not get it because the herds were far away, they ate pemmican, which they made from a mixture of dried buffalo meat and Saskatoon berries. From buffalo skins, they made articles of clothing, covers for teepees, and robes to serve as blankets for their beds. A stomach removed from the body of a dead buffalo could be used as a handy basket or container for carrying food and water. Buffalo bones could be fashioned into knives and other tools. It was not surprising that Indians occupying the prairie areas thought of these big animals as special gifts to them from the Great Spirit. What is now southern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan may have been the best of all buffalo country. The grass was short but nutritious, and it furnished good feed in winter as well as summer. It brought an advantage to the Blackfoot Indians living in that part, and they, knowing their good fortune in being so favorably located, fought savagely to protect their good hunting ground. It was at a time of migration that the animals came together to form the biggest herds, giving the impression that the plains were black with buffalo. A Northwest Mounted Police officer riding from Fort Macleod to Fort Capel told that for days he was never out of sight of buffalo. And Reverend John McDougall, the pioneer Methodist missionary, told of standing on Spy Hill on Calgary's north side and seeing buffalo herds on all sides. He believed he was seeing fully 500,000 of the big animals at that time. Well, Well, now, if you can look far enough north and east on a bigger river, you'll see the first white traders coming into our story. At this time, the fur trade was thriving farther east, and the demand for coveted beaver pelts brought adventurous explorers and fur traders farther west each year. Perhaps the largest fur bounty of all awaited in the valleys and the east slopes of the Rockies. At any rate, forts sprung up quickly along the shores of the many Alberta rivers and their tributaries, and the proud Plains Indians were soon to lose their domination of a land that had been theirs since their beginning. The years that follow now belong to the men of the rivers, fur traders, trappers, explorers, and the colorful voyageurs. They were in a class by themselves. The walls of the forts rang with their lusty commotion as they outfitted their canoes with trade goods in the spring, and again in the fall their crude York boats laden with pelts. Rowdy and fun-loving, their game was adventure and challenge of the unknown as they attacked work or leisure with equal zest. Trade was brisk. Every spring, the traders outfitted their canoes with flour, sugar, beads, tools, utensils, and liberal amounts of liquor, and traveled deep into Indian country, returning in late fall, their trade canoes laden with prize fur pelts. They followed the explorers, who kept up a constant search for new and better trade routes, opening the regions as they went. With compass and journal, charts and maps, they traveled by foot and canoe, serving as public relations men to the Indians for the fur companies. Men like Hendy, Gaddy, Thompson, Fiddler, Pond, and Mackenzie played a significant role in the early development of the region which is now Alberta. As the years go by, even the mighty fur empire goes the way of all great rains. What once seemed an inexhaustible supply of furs had quickly been depleted, and fashion no longer dictated fur hats to be worn. The silkworm has now become a predominant creature, and by the late 1860s, even major posts like Edmonton House have fallen deeply into debt. Fort Edmonton developed into a supply center for the Hudson's Bay trade, in particular that going north. Here, once again, it was the river that played a big part. You see, the North Saskatchewan River was a fine navigable freeway and saw a century of river traffic in the form of canoes, rafts, and York boats, which later gave way to paddle wheelers and barges. While Fort Edmonton and like posts in the north were developing into thriving communities embracing the agriculture industry little by little and attracting some permanent settlers, incidentally, that were the forefathers of the pioneers that we're soon going to see on our giant stage, little, if any, development was taking place in the south. However, it's time to turn our attention to the south. Now, when you look down here, you'll probably view that vast area as just so much waste. And also, you'll recognize an aversion to settling there because this is the home of the much-feared Blackfoot Indian. But if you watch as the 1860s and 1870s unfold, you're going to see a huge cast of American free traders come onto the scene. They're known as wolfers and whiskey traders, and they're going to set up little posts all over Blackfoot territory. Generally, their deportment's going to be questionable, and in short order, reports are going to the Canadian government of drunken, blood-letting brawls. It was a dark period, but a colorful one in Alberta history. These whiskey posts, such as Fort Whoop-Up, run by Hamilton and Healy, traded first-class buffalo hides for knives, blankets, guns, and a pint of brew that literally fried an Indian's mind. Fort Whoop-Up was the kingpin of them all, but there were others. Spitsy Post, Forts Standoff and Slide Out, Robber's Roost, and Whiskey Gap. And they were established by colorful personalities, too, like Liver-Eating Johnson and Dave Akers and Charles Thomas and Moses Solomon. The Whoop-Up Trail from Fort Benton, Montana to southern Alberta became a well-traveled route as trade goods and barrels of whiskey traveled one way and wolf pelts and buffalo hides went the other. The reign of the whiskey posts was a short one. It was only 3 seasons, but it was long enough to cause terrible poverty and grief on the once proud Blackfoot nation. Besides the demoralization caused by the whiskey, the buffalo slaughter resulted in near starvation for the natives. The crackle of gunfire from the Whoop-Up Trail was not unknown, or even rare. The whiskey traders were for the most part evil men, arrogant, cruel, and unfair. Finally, they overplayed their hand. It happened way east in the Cypress Hills. Some Plains Cree, full of rot-gut booze they got from the traders, set out on a horse-stealing expedition. The intention was to go south to the Blackfoot territory and raid their hated rivals. They didn't make it that far. They came upon a camp of American traders, and they soon decided the horse corral of the white man would provide as good ponies as would the Blackfoot encampment, and these were closer. Well, in the morning the Americans woke, and they soon had revenge on their mind. They set out 16 strong with lever-action rifles, determined to teach the horse-stealing Indians a lesson and also to get back their horses. They lost the trail of the Cree somewhere in the Cypress Hills, but by now they were not so bent on recovery as they were on revenge. Near where Fort Walsh now stands, just over the Saskatchewan border, they came upon a camp of innocent Assiniboine Indians. After sizing up the situation, they surrounded the camp, and in a callous, senseless massacre, they opened fire, killing 20 Indians. Well, that was the beginning of the end for the whiskey trader. The news of the atrocity soon reached the ears of the lawmakers in Ottawa. They had procrastinated for years on the fashioning of a police force for the lawless West, but this was too much. Within days, Parliament set up the machinery for the force that was to be known as the Royal Northwest Mounted Police. In fact, at the time, it was the Northwest Mounted Police. And in a year's time, they were recruited and headed west on one of the most famous police actions of all time. Now, if you look to the east, you'll see them coming. Green and saddle sore, they make up quite a parade nonetheless. Scarlet tunic, white helmets, oxen carts for provisions, livestock, ammunition wagons, and some 350 men. For most, their very first taste of the wide open spaces. That they were able to come through that torturous ride at all is remarkable. That they did it and still presented a formidable law enforcement body on arrival is, even today, one of their proudest accomplishments. The whiskey trader was finished. Even the arrival of 4,000 Sioux, fresh from the Custer massacre, didn't seem to faze these courageous young men. The forerunners of our present Royal Canadian Mounted Police were without doubt an example of self-discipline, devotion to duty and country, an example of courage that is rarely found singly and hardly ever displayed by an entire group. The first of the Redcoats received some valuable help from a famous Alberta Métis character named Jerry Potts. Without him, the whole brigade would have certainly had even more difficulties than they had already experienced. Well, they didn't know how to find celebrated Fort Whoop-Up. They had to have an interpreter to communicate with the Indians, and in Jerry Potts they had both guide and interpreter. Finally reaching Fort Whoop-Up, they found that the news of their coming had preceded their arrival, and the worst of the lawless traders had hightailed it for the border. Jerry Potts took them on north to the shores of the Old Man River, where the force set up the first western police post of historic Fort Macleod. It wasn't long after that that a detachment under Inspector Brisbois traveled north to the confluence of the Bow and Elbow rivers and established a second fort. It started out as Fort Brisbois, but it soon became Fort Calgary, named by either Colonel Macleod or Assistant Commissioner Irvin, both of whom were intensely Scottish. There seems to be a dispute as to which of the two actually did rename the tiny post. Well, the Mounties had little time to get used to their new home. Among their very first visitors at Fort Macleod was Chief Crowfoot, undoubtedly the most powerful and respected chief in the Blackfoot Brotherhood. It was fortunate that Colonel Macleod was able to favorably impress the wise chieftain as to their purpose, and Crowfoot was to become an important ally. The alliance between Redcoat and Chief Crowfoot reached its peak when on an historic date of September 22nd, 1877, on a beautiful knoll looking down on the Bow River, the official signing of the historic Treaty No. 7 took place. It signaled the end of open hostility between the warlike Blackfoot and their Plains brothers, the Blood, Pagan, Sarcee, and Stony tribes, and the incoming whites. The law had not only come west, its main purpose had already been accomplished. The early day Northwest Mounted Police made many contributions that are not normally credited to them. They did some farming. They delivered the mail for a time. And they were a great aid in the arrival of the railway on the prairies. When news of the arrival of the law on these untamed prairies reached the outside world, there was new interest in Great Britain and many countries in Europe. Land-starved and anxious for the right to farm their own land, many a European family began packing for the faraway Northwest Territories. The more adventurous husbands were already on their way, and many with little more than a pack on their back to lay claim to a quarter section of their own. Some packed a handful of seed with them, and they guarded that seed packet as closely as they did their money purse. It's often true that to be the very first into anything is not the best. Certainly these earliest of the new settlers found that. Pioneering is only for the very tough. But the trickle of new blood, new cultures, and new ideas was underway. In only a few short years, the rolling Atlantic Ocean would be highway for thousands of seasick adventurers on their way to the Promised Land. It's good that the sea captains, once started, would not turn back, or else many a wretched passenger would never have made Canada. But in the end they did, and that's where a new chapter begins in our Alberta. We can't get too detailed on all this, but let's see. You've watched a lot of drama unfold up to now. We skimmed through a few million years. You watched Alberta take shape, saw her rivers form, watched her mountains rise, watched as Indians and buffalo became the social order, saw the fur traders and explorers come west and set up forts and a new social order. You saw the whiskey trader's arrival and his hurried departure, and the great march west of the Northwest Mounted Police. Well, now, get set, because there's lots to come. The settling of Alberta has been mainly centered near forts on the North Saskatchewan up to now. Fort Edmonton has seen most of the development. Now, though, there are two events shaping up that are going to bring the South into the center of the stage. In far-off Ottawa, the Fathers of Confederation had been charting out the details of a railroad to reach right across the nation. Now, there were pros and cons as to the routes the new rail lines should follow, but in the end, it's decided that the sparsely settled southern part of Alberta is more favorable for the new railroad than the more heavily populated north near the Battlefords and Fort Edmonton. Meanwhile, in a completely unrelated incident, a colorful Alberta character named Kootenai Brown is selling the idea of free grass on Alberta's foothills to the cattlemen of Montana. Well, this man, Kootenai Brown, he was southern Alberta's first white settler. Actually, he was an Englishman who went wild. His adventures would fill a book. Anyhow, in one way, he was the start of Alberta's cattle industry. Now, the big rancher's day in the sun is about to begin. This is the start of a glamour that continues to ride through Alberta today. The cattlemen and the cowboys who ride for them. When the first herds were trailed up from Montana, they were herded by American cowboys. Some came from as far south as the Texas Panhandle. They were a great bunch. The cowboy of today has little resemblance to these cowhands, other than sharing a love for the outdoors and the caring of cows and horses. The two would barely recognize one another. You get the idea of a long, lean-hipped cowboy with gaily colored batwing chaps and a beautifully shaped, light-colored, wide-brimmed hat set at a jaunty angle. Well, today's cowboy is mostly always seen when he's on show, at a rodeo or taking part in one. To a working cowboy of the 1880s, he'd be looked on as a real dude. Now, I don't mean today's Alberta cowboy isn't tough. But pickup trucks and fenced-in pastures has sure made cow chasing a different thing than it was in the days of the trail herds in the open range. Now, let's look at the early cowboy. First of all, he came in all sizes and a variety of colors. Whites were predominant, but there were many great black cowhands. Indians were to become great cowboys. And the Mexicans can claim, validly too, that they invented the business. Number 2 fact about these cowboys is that they had to love what they were doing, else none of them would have done it. Take the real life of a cowboy and the glamour soon disappears. Hit the saddle at daybreak after you've cared for your horse, fed him, watered him, and curried him. Breakfast from the back of a chuck wagon, you can bet there'd be no frills. Remember, you can't keep too much over a period of many days in the back of a wagon under a hot, brassy sky. And then roundup begins. Ride for miles. Comb every draw and coulee and brush pocket. Get them all and then try and gather them up and then try and get them moving in the same direction. Never mind the direction you want them to go. Hot, dry, dusty, your horse as tired as you. You finally make camp to sleep in a greasy bedroll under the stars. And that would be the good days. What are the bad ones? When pouring rains turn to sleet, and then the early fall blizzard or the late spring blizzard hit with full force. Well, now you know why they chose Angora goat for their chaps instead of fancy batwings. If you were too far from camp to make it, you made a dry camp in a brushy coulee, and you shivered there until the weather cleared, and then gather 'em up all over again and head 'em for the camp. You had to understand cows, but you had to love horses. You often had to put your pony's comfort ahead of your own. Many a cowboy has carried the saddle himself and led a footsore cayuse for miles to ease the horse's suffering. And any cowboy will tell you that walking and cowboys don't get along, especially if you're carrying a 40-pound saddle. He was tough, and he was untiring. His hygiene was a little questionable because wrestling calves and trailing herds is not clean work. You bathed when you hit a stream or a river, if the flies and mosquitoes and temperatures would let you, and you generally dined out on a tin mess plate, standing up. Those trail drives were something else again. I'm going to borrow from an old novel here called Log of a Cowboy, and you can hear the trail boss giving advice to the greenhorns on his crew on the morning the drive is to get underway. Boys, the secret of trailing cattle is never to let your herd know that they're under restraint. Let everything that is done be done voluntarily by the cattle. From the moment you let them off the bed ground in the morning until they're bedded at night, never let a cow take a step except in the direction of its destination. In this manner, you can loaf away the day and cover from 15 to 20 miles, and the herd in the meantime will enjoy all the freedom of an open range. Of course, it's long, tiresome hours to the men, but the condition of the herd and saddle stock demands sacrifices on our part. And I want to caution you younger boys about your horses. There is such a thing as having 10 horses in your string and at the same time being afoot. Accidents will happen to horses, but don't let it be your fault. Keep your saddle blankets dry and clean, for no better word can be spoken of a man than that he is careful of his horses. In such emergencies as we're liable to meet, we have not a horse to spare, and a man afoot is useless. Well, those tough, wiry men of the saddle came. They came driving huge cattle herds ahead of them. Losses were heavy for the early cattlemen, but there was a determination among those first cattlemen that kept them coming. Each herd needed cowboys, and some stayed on. Others drifted in on their own. Soon, many big outfits were becoming well established. The grass was good, and shelter and water was abundant. Seemed everything that a cattleman wanted. But there was a head-on collision coming, and it started in the form of two ribbons of steel from the east. While the dusty cattle drives have come from the south, under the eyes of their sun-browned, leather-toughed drovers, a different breed of sinewy, hammer-swinging men have been laying the track at a rate of 5 or more miles a day, and the collision came smack at Fort Calgary in 1883. Cowmen and the railway, no, that wasn't bad, because it gave the cattlemen an easy access to eastern markets. But, and this is what hurt, it brought in settlers by the thousands. They came from eastern Canada, from Europe, from the United States, and they brought barbed wire and plow points. They fenced off their quarter sections, and the cattlemen could only fume in frustration. Eventually, Alberta's cattle industry learned to live with barbed wire, as did cattlemen everywhere, but the process did not come without some bitterness on the part of settlers and cowhands. The cowboys that came in with the early drives soon found eager students for their trade, and a meld of farm boy and cowboy helped bring an uncomfortable but livable truce between the two factions. Now the trains are coming more rapidly. Every one brings settlers. You can see them stepping off the train there at Calgary. Most of them recognize that they're not in prime farmland. They've traveled for nearly 1,000 miles over windswept prairie, hardly a tree in sight. And their weary faces and tired eyes can't help but show a dejection that seems out of place for the spirit and determination that they're going to need. But there's the landman to greet them and give them a new hope. You can practically hear him now as he points farther north. Up the Edmonton Trail, that's where they'll find it, only another 60 or 70 miles. Why, there's trees for shelter and creeks and springs on nearly every quarter. It's the follow me to prosperity kind of talk, and you can see the optimism starting to take the sag from tired shoulders and put the light back into the newcomer's eyes and the smile back on his lips. For many, it wasn't a matter of blind trust. They had to make it. They had everything on the line, and there was nowhere to go but ahead. Well, the Edmonton Trail did lead to everything the landmen could promise, and more. But it had to be tamed. The trees chopped, the land broken, the roots picked. Start with a shelter, a log hut, a sod shanty, a dugout on the bank of a coulee. Some started with a wagon box turned upside down and then built from there. Sweat, heat, cold. Mosquitoes, black flies, horse flies. Creeks in flood. Hail, thunder and lightning storms. Runaways, survey pegs you couldn't find. It was miles for supplies, and when a husband left, it may be for days. A lonely wife must have had many terror-filled nights as the harmless but fierce-sounding coyote packs yodeled outside the flimsy walls. And then the winter came, so cold it crackled in the night. Blizzards that raged for days at a time. The desperate job of caring for the livestock without adequate hay and shelter. If there was a creek for water, the ice was 2 or 3 feet thick. If it was a slough, it sometimes froze right to the bottom. If it was a well, the pump would be frozen. Melt snow for the house and haul water from somewhere for the cattle. As you watch these earliest newcomers to this harsh new land, you wish you could reach down and help. Whatever the odds, though, you'll always find some who can see a hope ahead. They support those around them. Many times a wife would be able to lend hope to a husband who might have broken. Often it went the other way. Sometimes it was a neighbor that sensed the despair, and with a visit and a fresh-baked loaf of bread or a pie could ward off the despair and make room for the courage that the troubled family needed to carry on. It was tough for the earliest ones. Breaking the land was the toughest of all. A man with an axe, facing an acre of tall poplar trees. That was one at a time. No wonder they became great axemen. No wonder they made every stroke count. The good ones made a deep cut on one side of a row of trees and then waited for a wind to come and lay the trees down for limbing, topping, and piling. You cut your own wood and pile burned the rest. And finally you hook onto the stumps, one at a time with whatever power you had. Some used a horse and a cow hooked together. The lucky ones had oxen. They were best of all. Some tried pulling stumps with a balky team. That could bring tears of frustration to the toughest man's eyes. And when you finally got a chunk cleared, you had to break it. The roots seemed like an impossible network, and they all had to be pulled and piled and burned. You pulled and you chopped, and then you did it again. Every square foot was a fight, and it was back-breaking work. Then there was hay to be put up with a scythe. In the hottest days of July and August, a man worked from dusk to dawn. He paused now and then to draw a stone from a hip pocket and hone the blade, and then back to his work. Well, no wonder you feel an empathy for these men and women of Alberta's parklands. Look, though. Help is on the way. New neighbors are coming. They arrive almost daily now. The flood of these newcomers has reached its crest, and even the most miserable jobs become bearable because others are finally here to share the task with you. Thousands of stories can be told of the parkland settlers. Further south or east, it's a different kind of homesteading. Here, the blizzards and the winds have double impact. See the wire from the house to the barn? Well, that's there out of respect for the blinding blizzards of winter. Before they started doing that, many a life was lost. Breaking the land was easier, but the rains came less frequently. Water was 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 Waterwoody, 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 Waterwoody. Winning. Are set up now. Wagon trains of supplies make trips shorter. You can feel that the settlers are winning. Oh, life isn't much easier, but they know too. They're winning. And now they're proud of what they've done. Immensely proud. Now, finally, there's a little time for some fun. There's baseball, hockey, soccer, and rodeos for the men and boys. And the women have quilting bees, socials, showers, and then together, couples can enjoy dances in the schoolhouse Christmas party. The war came too early. Men who were only beginning to get their land settled turned their walking plow on its side and shouldered arms. Fuzzy-cheeked farm boys who should have just been entering the joys of adolescence were forced to manhood. Their performance on the field of battle was immense. but the cost was terrible. But the job was finally over, and the triumphant winners came home, some limping, some in poor health, all aged beyond their years, but they came home to pick up where they'd left off. Wherever you look now, there's activity. Building, land clearing, lumbering, cattle herds growing, roads being built, railroads being finished, telephones making distances short, windmills everywhere to make work easier, even wind chargers and electricity, motor cars, coal mines, oil wells being developed. A fishing industry has emerged, and at Edmonton, a strange breed of men were flying fish out and mail into the far north. There's a terrible cloud on the horizon now. It's dust. 10 years of depression and low prices. 10 miserable, heart-wrenching years of poverty, tears, broken dreams. Foreclosure becomes a common word. The brightest hopes are dashed. Men and women who have survived the toughest odds will break now. Minds beset with the failures they see on every side will crack. This is Alberta's and Western Canada's darkest hour. You and I'll probably not fully understand how the Depression and that desperation could be solved by war. Even the weather, though, seemed to respond to the call to war. For with the opening rounds being fired, the West saw the searing winds give way to blessed rains. Once again, Canada went to war, and Albertans again more than played their part. Well, you've pretty well watched it all. The rest is so recent it isn't as much fun to review as it was, and besides there's an awful lot to see that we've had to miss. Let's look again, one last loving look together at our province. Start with the magnificence of our mountains, the raw power of our rushing rivers. Look across our thousands of acres of towering timber. Look to our marvelous Peace River country. Notice the nodding oil pumps in forest clearings, in mountain slopes, and in the peaceful pastures and gentle grainlands. Look to the northeast, where massive machinery and mighty plans are poised to assault a wealth of energy from the black of the tar sands. See our coal fields? An almost unending reserve. Alberta beef, standing knee-deep in the alfalfa fields of our irrigation country. From Writing on Stone Provincial Park by our good Montana neighbors to Wood Buffalo Park, bordering on the Northwest Territories. Look at her. Splendid in her thousand moods and colors. Rich in her history. Unbounded in her future. Of course you love her too. I adore her. Whether you look onto the busy streets of her modern, bustling cities, or the peaceful pastoral settings of her farms or ranches, you swell with pride for this gracious, kindly province. Yes, Alberta, you are a lady, and we love you. You have given us much. Most of all, you've given us the parents who know you best. The pioneers who sought and finally earned your favors. God grant, Alberta, we may always use you as you would have us to do.